Hi, and welcome to Ask the Expert series, Payroll Integration, a Cross-Functional View. I'd like to apologize for the delays we've had this morning. We've been running into some technical issues, but I think we've had them all resolved now. And by the attendees that we have joining us today, it looks like this is a very popular topic that everyone is very excited to hear more about. So today, as we're going through Ask the Experts, we're going to talk a little bit about our introductions and about collaborative, payroll integration, a cross-functional perspective, and then open it up for audience Q&A. As always, just make sure you enter your questions in the question functionality in the webinar, and we will get to you as quickly as possible. This is Danielle White, Vice President of Global Customer Engagement, and I'm proud to be here with you guys again today, and I'm going to pass it off first to Deanna.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. I was having a little trouble getting off mute. My name is Deanna Douglas. I work in the payroll department and I've been with Collaborative for more than 2.5 years, and payroll interface has been my primary function.
Thanks, Deanna. Madeline?
Hi, Madeline Countess here. I work in the HCM Consulting Services Group. I've been with Collaborative about 8 years and in the ecosystem for almost 10.
Thanks, Madeline. Our returning expert, Nick.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Paulo. I'm Director of the Absence and Time Tracking Team here at Collaborative. Today is actually my 6th anniversary at Collaborative, so excited about that. And I've been
Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Happy anniversary,
to celebrate.
Usha?
Hi, everybody. Usha Ramamurthy. Been in the Workday ecosystem for 8 years. I function as the integrations lead on several HCM payroll projects, payroll integrations, and I'm also the Workday product lead for third-party payroll.
Excellent. Thank you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Collaborative, I just wanted to talk a little bit about who we are. We are a finance, HR, and student cloud transformation consultancy. We are one of the longest legacy Workday partners in the ecosystem and are very proud of our over 800 Workday customers and our 98% customer satisfaction rate. As you dial in and wonder, how are we talking to the experts, you'll see here that we are Workday experts. We have over 100 product leads, many of which are on this call right now, and we're very proud of that statistic. We are also an all-encompassing strategy planning and change management, as well as post-go live services organization. So really seeking to help support you throughout your entire Workday journey. And as you see, we've deployed in over 125 countries. So definitely have a lot of experience deploying payroll integration globally. So with that, we're going to get started on the questions that we've been hearing from our customers. So for those of you who've joined us before, I'll go through the questions that we've heard in the past, and then we'll open it up for anybody who has questions on the line and make sure that we get through everything that we can. And if we don't by any chance, we will follow up with you via email later. So the first question is, when do I need a PI? And we've heard that we have employees in multiple countries, and the number of employees varies greatly from a couple of dozen to several thousand. Wondering if we take the same approach with all of our countries for payroll, or should we look at different options? Also, questions about the type of integration, understanding that there's more than one option on the type of integration that can be used for a payroll integration, and what are the considerations for each? The system of record, we're seeing a lot with IT governance, and so one of the questions we've heard recently is, per our IT governance model, we need to identify what is the system of record for each of our data points across systems. When using a PI, which system is the system of record for payroll data, Workday or the payroll system? Where do we enter data? So information such as personal information related to receiving pay could be entered direct deposit, for example, in Workday or in their payroll system. And what about earnings and deduction codes and time off requests? Expanding our PI globally, we've been live in Workday for a while, but are expanding our global footprint and need to set up PI for several countries. I'm worried we don't have all the data we need in Workday to support payroll in those countries. What HCM data do we need? And complex time and absence. Our time off and LOA plans are complex, or at least we feel that way. How do we make sure they work correctly with our PI? In our previous systems, we had a lot of trouble making sure our time fed into payroll properly. The other questions we've had is testing and understanding that testing is an important part of any system. What are some important steps to take to properly prepare? How early should we engage our third-party payroll provider? And once the needed data conversion, once the needed HCM payroll data is identified, what should we do to prepare ourselves for the data conversion files that will be requested of us? What type of data cleanup do you recommend? And pay results. If we use Workday as a system of record for our data points across systems, what are our options to bring in pay results from our third-party systems or third-party providers? So those are just some questions that we've received previously. I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to actually provide their questions here. But while we're waiting for that, I want to make sure that we get those questions answered. So again, if you have any additional questions, we'd like to hear from you. Please use the question functionality. But we'll go ahead and get started with the question on when do I need a PI? So we have employees in multiple countries, and the number of employees varies greatly from a couple dozen to several thousand. So Deanna, could you talk a little bit about what we do or what we think about when we need to implement a PI for a customer?
Yeah. Yes, of course. So one of the bigger things that we will think about is what is your employee count? So if you have 8 employees in Italy, but maybe 50 in the UK, then an integration in the UK might make sense, where in Italy, it might just make more sense to have reports of the items that you're planning to pass through from Workday to your payroll provider and what you actually need to get those employees paid out.
Are there any other considerations than just the number of employees that we might take into consideration?
Yeah, you'd want to also know what you're planning to pass. So if you're going to truly pass just demographic data like hire, fire, or terms, I should say, transfers, just address changes, locations, and then once you start getting into sending base pay, bonus payments, or ongoing allowance payments such as cell phone, car reimbursement, and also what other work streams you might have in your Workday platform, and you'd want to pass those things such as time, leave of absence, time tracking, benefits. Once you have more Workday modules in your platform, then I think it makes more sense to start passing it as an integration versus trying to maintain files and do it all manually.
Excellent. And actually, the question we have so far goes straight up to our second one, which is type of integration. I knew that was a popular question. So yeah, Usha, I'm going to call on you. The question is, when do you recommend to use PECI or PCHI as it's known instead of PI and use primary and ad hoc model? So can you talk to us a little bit about the types of integrations and what the considerations are for each?
There are 2 types of integrations. One is called the PCOF or the payroll interface common output file, and the other one is called the PCHI or the payroll effective change interface. With the PCOF model, it always supports just the top of stack event for a worker, and in the sense that if you were to do 3 or 4 different compensation changes, for example, you will the PCOF will always return the most recent compensation change for the worker. PCHI, on the other hand, if you had 4 different compensation changes effective on 4 different dates, or 3 different position changes, 1 is current, 2 of them are retro, then the PCHI model will send every single change that was entered for a worker, and even if the transaction had different effective dates, it returns the full stack of events. So that's the PCHI model. The different times when you would use PCOF versus PCHI. PCOF is if you are always returning, planning to use a full file, a full stack of workers. You're not saying give me changes only, but you need the full stack of workers, then you will go with the PCOF model. If you have less than 150,000 workers, then and if you're looking for all changes, full stack of changes, and in that case, you would go with the PCHI model. If you're looking to send, receive any correction on rescinds for transactions, the PCHI supports correction and rescinds. So any correction you make, any transaction you rescind, those are sent across on the payroll extract, and those can be transferred on the data file or in the XML extract to the vendor. Whereas in the peak-off model, it does not handle corrections and results. Instead, a report is generated on the integration event, and it's up to the user or the person supporting the payroll integration to go through the report and sometimes handle those changes manually, either on the handle those changes manually on the vendor side, or you may have to manually change the file and then re-upload the file to the vendor. So those are some of the times you use peak-off versus peachy. There are also several delivered connectors that are based on the peak-off and the peachy model. So if it is a vendor that supports the delivered connectors, then you can always go with the connectors. So there are different kinds of connectors like ADP Streamline, Safeguard, etc. that you can use. And the other time, if you're doing any time tracking integrations, then you can use the peak-off model.
Thank you, Usha. I appreciate that. Another question that we've heard in the past, as I mentioned, was about the system of record and whether, based on your IT governance model, what would be in this system of record for data points across systems. So I think, Deanna, could you talk a little bit about what's considered or what Workday's perspective is on system of record of data between Workday and payroll vendors?
So Workday recommends for the payroll, actual payroll data for your third-party provider to be the system of record. So it's really common to send payment elections because that sits in the personal data portion of Workday. But if you wanted to send federal elections, Workday would require you to have the payroll SKU, and they would recommend that you actually don't do it until a later date when you might want to bring US payroll. So anything HCM side, totally okay, have it there. But once you start getting into the payroll section with taxes, they recommend that you leave it in your third-party provider.
Okay. I think in a very similar manner is where do we enter the data? So where should personal information related to receiving pay be entered? And I know we've had a lot of conversations in the past, Deanna, about things like payment elections or direct deposits, for example. But there's also questions, obviously, about earnings and deductions codes and time off requests. Where does that typically do we see that being entered?
So anything that needs to pass through Workday, we would want it there. If you were going to pass a time off, such as a vacation or sick time, the payroll interface serves as a shell. So you need that mapping. So for those earnings, we would put them in. However, if benefits wasn't in scope and you're not passing anything for benefits, we would leave all the deductions that cover benefits off and leave that with your third-party payroll provider. So anything that's going to pass through Workday, of course, we want you to enter it there. We want you to have a record of it and keep it there. But if it's not going to pass through Workday, then leave it out of Workday. And at a later date, if you decide to bring any of those items into Workday, such as benefits that I used in my earlier example, then at that point, start passing it through.
And I think that's an excellent point, Deanna. And we've got a follow-up question, but just while we're here is, that's been a question we've seen in the past where, customers might have had a third-party benefits integration, for example, and they wanted to send the data from their third-party benefits provider into Workday and then from Workday into their payroll provider. And we really recommend that, at the point that you're doing that, you're using Workday as your system of record for benefits, right?
Right.
Great. The follow-up question we had is, do you recommend partition the data returned in the payroll interface? Payroll, one-time payments, time off, and time tracking, meaning create a single PI for every one of those. I know Workday recommends to have a separate for time tracking, but wanted to see if there were others that we would recommend having a separate for. So I'm not sure if that, Deanna or Usha, if you can help with that.
I'm going to default to Usha for this one.
Sure. So mainly time tracking integrations, we have always kept those separate because time tracking integrations they are usually run only once per pay period. So we always have a separate time tracking integration, whereas the worker data changes, some of them are sent daily. And if you're using a PG model, you can send those files up to twice a day. So, and the employee data changes are always primary, or most of the time you can schedule and set them up as primary payroll integrations. And it is certainly a good idea to keep your time tracking one separate, because they are sent only once per pay period. We have sent separate files for different data points like earnings, deductions, one-time payments, payment elections. We have sent separate files to send those data to the vendor, but the payroll integration itself, we just use the one payroll extract, but pull the data out of it and send different files. But I don't see a reason for you to have separate integrations for those different files like earnings and deductions. The only time you would have more than one payroll integration is for worker data changes and time tracking. And if they're all scheduled as primary payroll integrations, you may need an ad hoc one to do any one-off changes or corrections, or correct a worker, and you may want to send just that one worker as an ad hoc. That's the only time you would use an ad hoc integration.
Okay. Dylan, I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, please shoot us a note and let us know. I think as we've seen, obviously, from expanding our PI globally, for those that are expanding into other countries and have concerns about what data may or may not already be in Workday, Madeline, the question in the past has been, we've been live in Workday for a while, but are expanding our global footprint and need to set up PI for several countries. I'm worried we don't have all the data we need in Workday to support payroll in those countries. What HCM data do we need?
So that's a great question, and it is likely to be country specific and even specific to your global payroll provider. We do typically see outside of this country information that is required that is not something we would typically see in the US. So things like your highest level of education if you're in Saudi Arabia. Other Middle Eastern countries, we need to pass over the number of dependents that are eligible, who are relying on you, essentially. We sometimes have to pass over your mother's maiden name kinds of things. So it's really important to get a handle on that and to check with your global payroll provider to understand exactly what they require for new hires. And then we can find a spot for that in Workday. Typically, there's always a place for it. Occasionally, we have to set up a custom object, but that's actually less rare. We just generally need to make sure that we have the data available so that we can pass it over and that we are gathering it in a timely manner for your new hires.
I think, Madeline, that's one of the things that you and I've seen in our past is making sure you get that information very early so that you understand what the requirements are per country so that we can work with you to make sure we find that proper home for it within the HCM section.
Yep, exactly.
Thanks, Madeline. The other question we have is about complex time and absence. So Nick, our time off and LOA plans are complex, or at least we feel that way. And we've had issues in the past with making sure our time not worked fed properly into payroll. What can you tell us or talk to us about how to make sure our time off and LOA plans are working properly with our payroll integration?
Yeah, no, happy to talk through that. I think a lot of it has to do with the initial discovery process that you go through with your clients and making sure you get to that the functional consultants sit in the conversations with the integration consultants through the field level process. So you can have a very thorough understanding of what the payroll provider requires in order to process pay. A lot of times from a policy perspective, we may build something one way in Workday and it meets your needs, but we need to make sure that we are accounting for what that third-party payroll provider requires in order to process it. We've seen interesting things like in Italy, the payroll processor said, oh, well, we need in and out times in order to process the time off. And in Workday, that requires you to leverage time tracking. So you have to figure out, is this something that we can do. Is it worthwhile effort? And is it worth it from even a SKU perspective, a subscription cost for an organization? So again, it's just making sure that everybody is aligned and on the same page early on, and really the cross-functional interaction between the integrations team and that functional team is key. But to the point of complex requirements, everyone thinks they have complex requirements, and you might, but you know, it's a common perspective that people have of themselves and their organization, but we can always find a way to get through it. We get creative, but again, understanding those intricacies and where you think you're complex early on gets everybody there that much quicker.
See, and now, Nick, I can say that it's been 6 years that I've been reaching out to you every time I hear complex leave off and time tracking requirements. So thank you for always being my expert to go to over these past 6 years.
Happy to do.
And I think you bring up an excellent point. I think payroll integration, you know, is probably one of those areas where we really do need to make sure we have cross-functional representation, right? I mean, it is truly, you know, payroll and HCM and compensation and benefits and time and leave of absence that, you know, work very collaboratively, you know, as it were, with our integrations folks, because there is so much functional information that is being shared on those integrations, and understanding the requirements at the for how it's going to be used helps us make sure that we're setting it properly in the first place.
Absolutely.
So we know that working with all of our customers over the years, that testing is always a huge concern for them. It turns out people like to be paid correctly. And so with that, you know, as we think about testing, you know, questions abound from our customers about, you know, what are important steps for us to take to properly prepare ourselves, and how early should we engage our third-party payroll provider? So I think I'm going to call on Deanna again. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what we say are best practices from a testing perspective for payroll integration?
Yeah, so once you start testing is completely on you, the customer. We can help you as much as we can, but we're limited in what we can actually see since we're working in Workday. A lot of our help comes from helping you troubleshoot or remapping items that you're trying to send over. So we always recommend that you engage your provider as your vendor as early as possible. So if you're using Cloud Pay, for instance, we would ask you to have those conversations early on, because they're really the ones that are going to have to help get those test files into their system and confirm what they're receiving from Workday, and that it is what you're expecting to receive. And if it's not, how can we troubleshoot it? And sometimes those conversations and coordination can take a long time just to get set up. So the earlier you can engage them, the earlier you can prepare yourself. It'll just help things go a lot smoother. And so we're not rushing to test anything and really feeling that we're against some really tight deadlines. We always make a backup plan, of course, but if we can get it right the first or second time, it's always best than getting up really close against deadlines. Another way to properly prepare yourself is just to look at your system. And if you have local payroll managers in other countries, ask them to do a cleanup of their system, like ask employees to check their data, make sure that you have really clean codes, that everything is working correctly in the way you want. Sometimes when we start testing, you start looking at your legacy data and you realize that some things weren't correct. So this is really a time that we can fix that. But if you can fix what you can in your legacy system, then when you're sending it over, it's just more concise.
Thanks, Deanna. I always recommend to customers too is to make sure you understand your contractual agreements with your third-party vendors. And while this is true for all of them, obviously, you know, your payroll is especially, you know, relevant. You know, understand what their requirements are for if they're in a code lockdown because they're doing some upgrades to their system. You know, understand what their turnaround times are going to be, you know, per your contract with them, so that, you know, if we say we're going to send them a file, do they have, you know, 48 hours to get back to us, 72 hours to get back to us, you know, 5 days to get back to us. It's good to know all of those things up front so that we can really help develop a strong testing approach and plan so that we can get through everything in a timely manner.
Agreed. And just engaging all teams as well, making sure that if we're helping you, then you have your functional and your integration consultant on those calls to help you understand certain things you might not.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the next question, Deanna, and I'm not sure if this is going to be you or Madeline or a tag team of the two of you, but, you know, one of the questions we have is, once the needed HCM payroll data is identified, what should we do to prepare ourselves for data conversion files that will be requested? And what kind of data cleanup do we recommend?
From the payroll side, if you're going to send payment elections, which is super common, I would check to see how many bank accounts your employees have. Sometimes they have some that they don't use anymore, but they're sitting on there. So depending on how the data pulls out of your system, you might come across more than one bank and you're not sure which one they're using. You can't really, I know PeopleSoft has trouble identifying which one can be their primary, sometimes depending on how old your system is. So I would try to do that cleanup. I'll let Madeline speak to the HCM side, but I know something that payroll testers have called out a lot is, especially if you've merged several systems or you just had a change in hands and who was doing the data key entry, consistency on format tends to be a big thing, and like dashes and characters that's in data. So I'll let Madeline speak to it as well.
Yep. Thanks, Deanna. So from a functional standpoint, when we have a situation where HCM is in play, but we haven't been paying people out of our HCM system, there is a tendency for compensation to not be synced up between your payroll provider, which is really your system of record for pay at that point, and Workday. So the first thing we recommend that you do is you take a look at the comp data that's in Workday, and you take a look at the comp data that's in your payroll provider and make sure that it's actually the same and that what you have in Workday is accurate. We also are going to recommend that you take a careful look at your compensation processes. Think request comp change, change job, anything that's going to update comp in Workday, and make sure that those processes are streamlined and that you are going to be able to drive those comp changes first in Workday and then second to payroll. Because you're really switching things around here when you start using a PI. It's a great change for your managers because it's really, you know, it brings them back to that power of one, but you want to make sure that you really have comp set up correctly. And you're also going to want to think about that from a testing perspective. So when we talk about testing on the functional side, there are really two critical areas that we want to really hit on heavily during testing. So one is dates, and how does the effective date and the, hang on, let's see if I don't know if I can fix that echo or not. But you want to make sure that you're testing the effective date versus the entry date, and to understand carefully what goes over on that PI during each run, and then also to test corrections and rescinds. As Usha mentioned earlier, both or all three kinds of integration handle those a little bit differently. And we just want to make sure that you understand exactly what's going over and conversely what's not going over, so that you can take appropriate action if there's anything that you need to actually manually let your payroll provider know about. Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks, Madeline. I was going to actually call on Nick because while they called out HCM and payroll data, Nick, are there any considerations for time tracking or absence data we should share?
Very much so. And so you want to make sure that you're accounting for pay period dates for time tracking, similarly to as you would in a full parallel process, meaning you want to identify those periods where you have holidays, where you have if you have any cyclical activities within your business, you want to make sure that you're hitting on those periods. If you're in an industry where furloughs are regular, you want to make sure that you're capturing those periods. So you need to holistically think about your business when your challenging times or where your heavy payroll times are. You know, although it might be hard to swallow, you really want to take on those periods for testing purposes, just to make sure that you are getting every iteration and flavor from an absence and time tracking perspective.
Thanks. I think the last question we really have here is around pay results and using Workday as a system of record for data points across systems, and what are the options for bringing in pay results from a third-party payroll provider. So I think this is probably a mix of Deanna and Usha here.
I'm going to let Usha take this one and actually speak to the integration piece of it.
Okay.
Sure. So for the payroll results, there is an inbound integration that you can use to bring in payroll results, and typically it there's a specific format. If the vendor can produce, can give you files in that specific format, you can import all the up to, I believe, 100 earnings and deductions for a pay result. You can import those into Workday. And in the event that they cannot give you a file in that specific format, then you can always go for a custom solution of an inbound studio where you're loading all your results into the external payroll results, and you can report off of that. The other commonly used inbound are the payslip data, and again, if the vendor can provide a PDF files of those payslips, then there's a delivered connector that can be used to import all your payslip data.
Thanks. I think that's probably functionality that a lot of people are interested in. So I'm glad to hear we've got the delivered connectors to help our customers with that. So right now we're looking at 43 past the hour, and we haven't had any other questions come in. If anyone does have any other questions after, please feel free to email us at digitaltransformation@collaborativesolutions.com, and we will be sure to follow up with you. We'll also send out responses to the questions that were asked today. And thank you very much for everyone joining us in our Ask the Expert series.